two of my colleagues sat me down, and I remember this very vividly. They printed out all of their boards and they said, "Hey, Sarah, which of these boards do you think it makes sense to come tag along to so that we can teach you and train you?"
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
We are excited to sit down with Sara Choi, a partner at Wing VC. Sara was a co-founder at Airfox, a mobile data company, before joining Wing in 2019. Sara spends her time investing in very early stage companies at the exciting intersection of bio and data. Welcome, Sara.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with when you were growing up in a household with immigrant parents. Can you maybe touch on kind of what the American dream looked like in their eyes?
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, my parents came here from Korea, and their parents, in fact, were immigrants to Korea to begin with. So when I was growing up, I felt like the narrative in my household was very much where there's a will, there's a way. And I would equate that to what society would call the American dream, where although we grew up in a household with blue collar immigrant parents, my brother and I definitely felt empowered to take our destiny in our own hands and maybe break conventional norms in terms of what we did professionally. So, at least from my perspective, I credit my parents, that upbringing, that philosophy with everything to come, including my entrepreneurial journey and including some of the empathy that I have for immigrant founders, even today in my job as a VC.
And we'll definitely get into that journey and the many jobs that you tried along the way. You were very academic driven. And so did that academic focus stem from your parents?
It's so funny because it did not. My parents are the kind of parents who'd say, "Sarah, you know what? Maybe you need to learn some more humility. Like, just go out there, go get a B." Whereas I feel like maybe most of my friends' parents would say, "Go out there and get an A." Mine were the ones that said, "Go out there and get a B," because their view was they had made this arduous journey from Korea to the United States in order to give me and my brother the opportunity to do something different. So, in fact, they wanted us to grow up and be a little bit more adventurous in ways that they couldn't, being tied to their jobs. My dad was a mailman. So, no, I don't think that's actually where it came from.
So what was their reaction when you got the Harvard acceptance letter?
Utter disbelief. Utter disbelief. It was probably in my top 5 favorite days today. I just remember that feeling of, wow, not only did I do this for myself, but I made their investment and all of their sacrifice worth it. And to see that sort of join your parents, gives me the chills even to today.
I have the chills. And then, ironic enough, while at Harvard, you drop out. And so you decided to try different jobs. You go to the UN, Science and Policy Think Tank, an NGO in the Dominican Republic, just to name a few. Maybe the impetus for one dropping out after working so hard to get in. And then, how did these experiences really shape your entrepreneur journey?
Yeah, I went to college having come from a relatively small town. And honestly, I feel like I had an identity crisis at a very young age. I was 17 at the time, where all of a sudden I looked around and I was like, wow, the world is so much bigger than I expected or knew. And how can I properly make an informed decision about my career and who I want to be if I don't even know myself? So you're right. I did make that decision to take some time off from school, had a bunch of different jobs ranging from, as you mentioned, UN, working for a judge at some point, science and policy think tank, NGO, nonprofit consulting, all these different things. And really, it was a mentor who tapped me on the shoulder at one point and said, "Sarah, it seems like you're searching for who you want to be and what you want to do. But actually, if you think about the actions of what you're doing right now, I think that maps perfectly onto being a founder, being an entrepreneur." crafting your own journey, driving towards some sort of a vision, and having intellectual curiosity along the way. So I don't necessarily credit the time off with my decision to try to be an entrepreneur, but I definitely credit that time with deep introspection and learning some fundamentals about myself that hopefully made me a better leader when I did choose to become a founder, 5 or 6 years down the road.
And were you a founder pre-business school?
I had spent a few years at YouTube, met my future co-founder there. We worked on two businesses together. First one was not venture backed, second one was. And then the second one, thankfully, we sold for modest exit, nothing crazy, modest exit. And then I was able to go to business school after that.
If you could go back, would you take venture capital money again?
Asking the hard questions. All right. I know, I love it. It's great. As a venture capitalist, I'm supposed to say yes, right? It's kind of in the best interest of my professional career to say yes. But honestly, I think it's such a personal decision for every founder. And for me, it made a ton of sense. But I can't say that without qualifying it. It made sense for me because with my second company, because the first one was not VC backed. And the first one was an unmitigated, complete train wreck of a disaster. I am not one of those people who exaggerates. So that is not an exaggeration. It was just such a hot mess. And I really craved the hands-on advice, mentorship, the wisdom of people who had a vested interest in helping me. And I found that in my VCs in the next company. So for my personal arc and my personal journey, I think it made sense. And I don't regret that decision at all. But hey, I don't think it's actually right for everyone.
And I think it depends also a lot on the industry and who you're targeting and kind of the growth that you're wanting to hit.
Exactly.
So that's a fair answer.
Yeah. And if you want work-life balance, if you want to be able to control other aspects of your business, your personal life, we're integrated humans. And those things also really matter. So I would never fault someone for saying, hey, I don't want a 10x or a 100x return. I just want a good, healthy paycheck and to be doing the things that I love. Like, I would never fault someone for that.
There's some great vertical SaaS companies can grow 20% a year, have a 9 to 5, roll up some car washes.
There you go. Laundromats. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. And then post business school, you join Wing. And I think we've had a few people on the show who have taken the business school to venture route, which we're really learning about. But in terms of this episode, we'd love to touch on day one at Wing. I mean, what does that look like? And how is their training method different than a traditional VC, which some could argue VCs don't even have a training methodology?
So true. It's funny in retrospect, but I joined Wing first as an intern. I was over 30. I didn't think in my life I would be an intern again. But I chose to do my business school internship with Wing for a couple of reasons. One, to exactly suss out exactly what you just mentioned, Laura, because I think it's really important to understand the people you're going to work with for potentially the next 10 to 20 years and how they're going to train you and treat you as a teammate. So I did a try before you buy thing, spent 3 months embedded with a team, also did pretty intense diligence checks on every single teammate on my team to make sure I was joining a group that I felt comfortable with in terms of them being good people, not just good investors. And then I got a taste for how Wing likes to operate. So day one, after I accepted that full-time offer, I came into the office, and the model was, and still is, a heavy apprenticeship model, meaning the pressure was taken off for me to just have to go out there and blindly source and do deals, which I found super refreshing because that feels like it might have led to some bad muscle memory and undue pressure to just do deals at any cost, when in reality, that's not how good investing's done. So when I joined, two of my colleagues sat me down, and I remember this very vividly. They printed out all of their boards and they said, hey, Sarah, which of these boards do you think it makes sense to come tag along to so that we can teach you and train you? And we sat there and we picked 8 boards, quite a lot actually, ranging from an incubation, so the earliest type of company, all the way through to a company that was more destined for an IPO, which had 20 people in the boardroom, including founders at other VC firms. So hopefully that gives you a taste for what the apprenticeship model looks like at Wing. It's very hands-on, it's very deliberate, and it's very much about education, at least at first, until you become a fully ramped investor. And then, of course, there are other things that come into play. Yeah, off to the races, drink from the fire hose. But the whole apprenticeship model, I mean, it took probably 2 or 3 years before I got to be a fully ramped investor in the eyes of Wing.
And fast forward now, you've been at Wing for over 4 years. I think it'd be helpful if you just walk the audience through the background of Wing. And my understanding is Peter Wagner left, was it Excel? It's been around for decades now in 2011 to start Wing. Walk us through the founding story of Wing and kind of competitive differentiation in your perspective.
Oh, happy to. So you're right. Peter previously co-led Excel, had an amazing track record, and managed large sums of money. And then he teamed up with Gorov, who previously had spent over a decade at Sequoia. Both of them presided over large amounts of capital, changing strategies, which involved spinning up late stage funds, international funds, bifurcating the early stage from the later stage in different funds. And at one point, they realized that the attention was going towards where the money was, so later and later stage. And it seemed like there was a gap in the market for a VC to take high conviction early bets, which we do here at Wing, oftentimes when companies have no revenue and no product, and then to provide those companies with really hands on support to help founders grow and mature to be public and largely successful CEOs. Wing was started about a decade ago, and I think that thesis holds true today. We take high conviction bets and we're able to move fast and we're able to invest pre product, pre revenue in a lot of cases because we are thematic experts in what we do. I spend a disproportionate amount of time actually in the market, understanding trends, talking to experts, so that when I do meet a company, I have the pattern recognition of being able to understand the market at least fairly quickly. And then I can spend more time working with the team.
Very fascinating. And I know you guys focus on a decent amount of exciting AI enabled technology businesses, which obviously have a lot of demand for being on those cap tables. I'd love to hear how you view, albeit at the earliest stages, weighing being on a really incredibly interesting business with entry valuation, or if that is a consideration at all, given how early you're investing.
We do enterprise tech, all 7 investors, and then each of us has a thematic focus area. And each of the focus areas has their own nuance in terms of valuations at the entry stage. You're right, especially in AI, some of these entry valuations are nonsensical. Like there's no revenue, you can't do a DCF. It's like, where do these valuations come from? Um, and so we end up taking bets on these companies at prices that only will, pan out if things go according to how we imagine the world will look like in the next 10 years. It's definitely not a job for the faint of heart, as you both know. So when we think about valuations and when it makes sense for us to engage, I would say still it makes sense for us to engage and provide the full suite of services, help with marketing, talent, customer network, research even. And of course, our strategic help as board members. I think that makes sense when we can have higher ownership. So somewhere in the 20% range for those early checks. And so a lot comes down to round size and valuation in terms of achieving that 20% mark.
Thinking back to a little bit of your time training with Wing, after your first year, you decided to double click on health and bio. We have a lot of listeners to the podcast who are generalist investors themselves. Walk us through your thought process in selecting that sector and just the decision making process to specialize in a sector in general.
There are, of course, many different ways of investing, but I tend to really subscribe to this thematic focus area, prepared mind model, which some firms have, including Wing. I think in this day and age, when we are competing as VCs based off of our product offering, which ends up being the support and value we can bring as investors, I think that I can bring the most value and support and genuinely help guide these companies and founders to a good place if I'm deep in the trenches, in the weeds of a specific domain. It not only helps me make better, faster decisions when it comes to investing, it also helps me in the long tail for the next 10 years to guide founders to good opportunities and good exits. So I already knew that I wanted to focus on something. And my colleagues, when I showed up day one, said, for the first year, don't feel the pressure to constrain yourself. Just be open. Go be a generalist. Go be a sponge. Go learn as much as possible. If you gravitate towards a specific area, you can specialize, but don't do that until maybe the 1 year mark. So I researched a lot of areas. For example, I researched autonomous car tech. That was actually my first area of interest. And then I researched more traditional B2B enterprise apps. Actually, the first deal I sourced is Jellyfish, which is an engineering management company, which we invested in. Has nothing to do with health and bio. But as I was surveying the landscape and thinking about markets, and really the criteria I used for myself was, is there a why now? Do I feel like we're early in a super cycle that will last 10 years? Do I feel like I and Wing can compete and win in this space? And do I have proprietary deal flow? Like, do I feel like I can do a good job sourcing? So when I applied that lens to different sectors, I saw that something interesting was happening in biodata at the convergence of computation and biology, as well as in healthcare. Not like traditional healthcare, but healthcare as we reimagine it for the next 10 years. So that's how I made my first couple of investments. And then in the course of living with those investments, I learned more and more, was able to further hone my thesis. But gosh, the whole process was years, not months. And I think it'll continue every single year because the world is moving so rapidly. So I like to sit down and go over my thesis twice a year. And we just did that exercise at an offsite at Wing where you actually present your thesis updates to the group. And so I think it's a constantly evolving process, but I'm so happy that I chose the sectors that I did.
For younger investors looking to specialize, what advice would you have? You mentioned the various factors that you evaluated. Would you suggest that that's what people evaluate, or are there any other pieces of advice you'd give to investors looking to specialize?
The number one mistake that investors and founders make alike, especially early on, is not considering the market and those dynamics enough. A company could get to interesting revenue, but have the market turn on them or have it not be the right why now because they're at the tail end of a super cycle as opposed to in the beginning. And to be late is fatal. To be early is really uncomfortable. You want to hit that sweet spot of hitting a super cycle as it's taking off. So, my advice to new investors is think about markets very carefully. And that might mean you're going to sacrifice the hours you have in a day. So you're not going to the nth happy hour or going to the nth conference for whatever. You might be instead talking to professors, talking to customers, talking to supernodes who are giving you the intel of what's to come. Because really, our job is to invest in how the world will look, which doesn't exist, which is so hard. So initially, that's all I did. I talked to experts, luminaries, things like that. And my day to day, I noticed, looked very different than my friends at other firms. But I think that gave me the good foundation to place my bets wisely.
And you mentioned you presented your thesis, but I think the intersection of health and data and bio and drug discovery, it's pretty broad. So what are the themes that you presented and how did you pick those specific themes or areas?
Two separate themes. They're very distinct, as you mentioned. The first one in bio, it's really about the high throughput ability to generate data, which we did not have before ever, where through machines, this machinery is spitting off data in the omics. For example, now we don't just have genomic data, which was very valuable, don't get me wrong, but now we have transcriptomic data, we have metabolomic data, we have proteomic data, just these giant data sets, which are perfect for tools like ML to go and make sense of. And that's how we're able to dramatically increase the discovery and validation of new drugs to get to a world of precision medicine. So I look for companies that are generating novel data, applying computation, to create platforms for drug discovery with multiple shots on goal. So it's a very, very specific thing. And then in health, I'm looking for companies that are leveraging new business models because the world is actually moving to capitation and value based care arrangements. So I'm looking for companies that are typically enabling independent providers, getting them credentialed with the payers, and taking care of patients way better than before. For example, in mental health, these therapists are taking care of patients covered through insurance, and they're saving these patients from having to go to the emergency room, which ultimately fuels a business model where payers are willing to pay more in terms of reimbursements for this care. So it's a nice trifecta value for the providers, patients, and payers.
How are you seeing healthcare providers adopting these technologies? Are you seeing interest in the field since you spend a lot of time on the ground working with the people, meeting patients, and using these platforms?
For sure, but in pockets. So I would say health systems, super tough to sell into right now. Some of them have negative margins. So providers within a system like that, yeah, might be harder to get adoption. But some of the fastest growing companies in all enterprise tech are healthcare companies that serve independent providers. So what do I mean by that? This might be ABA therapist who works with children who wants to own their book of business, have flexible work hours, and get paid more. So now there are so many companies popping up to try to capture providers like that and provide them a really nice experience and figure out all the complexities on the administrative side. And diabetes care was one of the first that ended up taking off, kidney care, mental health slash behavioral health. Some of these areas of focus actually have tremendous growth, and we are seeing providers want and use these solutions.
And how are you finding or meeting these companies at the sometimes pre product, pre revenue stage?
Because I know your audience is largely comprised of people looking to get into venture maybe early on in the careers, I'll give you a little tip. So when I first started, I met every single company that was in my sweet spot, irrespective of honing in on my thesis. I was very broad. So I'd pack my calendars just trying to understand trends, trying to get information, trying to calibrate. And then from there, I ended up making a couple investments. And those founders provide me a ton of lead gen. They're constantly referring more deals to me. And the people that I met who helped me diligence and get smart on the space also are really great providers of lead gen. So I decided to create my brand in micro communities. I might not have a brand, for everyone, but in the communities I care about, people tend to know me because I found these little pockets and nodes that are around people to help refer deals to me. And then I might do speaking things, small groups, thought pieces, stuff like that. But it's always very targeted and almost bottoms up in its nature.
Would you say that that's your superpower is more so the network or community based approach? Because every venture capitalist has something that is special or they are known for doing this and this is what makes them great. Some people could be the go to cap table or diligence guru. I think some people, it's a community building aspect. Some people are scraping and finding every single company on the internet. So I think every person has their superpower. Is that what you would define as yours?
When it comes to sourcing, I would say first and foremost, it's actually through the thematic focus area work, because then when you intersect a founder, they're more likely to work with you because they know what you're about. And so it's actually my thematic focus work and then community building within that thematic focus area that I think would probably be considered my special secret sauce.
As an aside, I mean, do you think the imposter syndrome in venture, because we've all felt that, we continue to feel that, especially early in our career. Do you feel that that goes away at a certain point?
No, I don't, because I have friends who are older who have been doing this for a long time. And I think the best investors actually have a bit of healthy paranoia. And unfortunately, in some cases, that translates into imposter syndrome. And I would say it's irrespective of age, but should be addressed. Where I know people who are very junior who don't have imposter syndrome because they have done the therapy, done the work to get rid of it. So unless you address it, I think if you have it, it probably will persist. But there are things you can do to help manage it. And so I'm constantly checking myself to make sure that I'm not carrying forward bad mental health habits, for example, imposter syndrome. But I think it's actually not tied to age. It's more of like a personality thing and a habit that we fall into that can be addressed and probably should be addressed.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I ask because it is such a competitive job that we're in an industry, and you're speaking with people who are smarter than you every day because they're the ones living, breathing, and building these companies. Whereas we're also smart in the spaces, but we're not, on the ground with them.
Oh, totally. Every single room I'm in with my bio founders, I'm the least qualified, least smart person in that entire room. I know that. And at first, yeah, it's so overwhelming, especially rewinding back when I didn't have companies at 300 million, 160 million, 70 million in top line. Like, yeah, you have kind of no leg to stand on. But then what I would always go back to in my mind is, okay, I'm not going to be the technical expert here, but do I have to be to add value? Actually, if you're backing the right companies, you should feel comfortable that they have the technology covered. And what I can bring and what I do bring is intimate knowledge of business models, strategy, competitive intel, and a desire to actually be hands on and help. And you know what? Founders really respond to that. So I try to keep my imposter syndrome in check by just reminding myself of those things that I can uniquely bring.
And that's a great transition into your value add, which something that you do is you host office hours for founders, which is a great way to give back and share the knowledge that you've acquired over the years from being a founder and investing in similar types of businesses. So, what do these office hours look like, and what's really the goal of the platform?
Oh, yeah. I just have space devoted on my calendar every single week. It's a few hours, it's a real time commitment to be able to pay it forward, where I absolutely could not have built and sold my last company without the help of the community. People around me who were willing to donate their time and resources. Sometimes they're a comp, a lot of times not, to help me. So I hold open office hours so anyone can sign up. And I might not be value add, right? If I know nothing about your business or your space, yeah, I probably won't be. But I can at least be a friendly voice to listen, to witness what you're going through, to maybe provide a connection or two. I get a lot of value from it too. It's not just the founders. I feel really good about being able to provide this. And my only ask in terms of repayment is that those founders then go on to help others in similar ways. And I feel like through that ripple effect, maybe we can help each other with people's world changing ideas. And that's the goal at the end of the day, isn't it?
I agree. And speaking of world changing ideas, I'm going to pass it to Will to touch on some of these like macro trends and thoughts that are going on right now.
Yeah, sure. So I think a great place to start, and I'm very curious to get your thoughts on, is just the movement in drug development and how it's evolved rapidly towards a decentralized model. Historically, obviously, it was very much run by big pharma, but now you're seeing biotechs really emerge. Just talk us through your thoughts on what are the real areas for opportunity for startups in this space, and why now? Why are things being enabled by data in this day and age?
You're right. Historically, drug development was done within these big pharmas, and they weren't always big. Genentech was a small startup at one point, right? And we, I think, lose sight of that in the fullness of time. But all organizations build muscle and they build DNA, and it's hard to compete on multiple fronts. And I would say pharma's advantage is that they are incredible at marketing, production, actually taking a drug through market. But what could a biotech's advantage, a startup's advantage be? It could be on the technology side. And in fact, that has proven to be true. So 80% of drug development is done within biotechs, within these startups, not done within big pharma anymore. And pharma is well capitalized to be able to purchase or partner to get those assets down the road. So you have an interesting why now, where you have a customer base that's well capitalized, that wants to buy your new molecule or whatnot and pay handsomely for that. And you have these upstarts which can compete based off of tech, which is exactly where we would like to play. So I think the opportunity now is for newer companies to leverage this high throughput data so that you're not blindly testing here and there, trying to run into a drug or a target, but you're using data and ML to narrow the zone of inquiry. So you know that when you do have to put resources in the lab to work, that you're doing it in a cost-effective, efficient way, building molecules that are actually safe and efficacious and have higher likelihoods to get approved. So the cycle for drug development and the total number of dollars in drug development have dramatically gone down. And that is happening right now. We're in the beginning of a super cycle. I see it every day. And I think we're going to see the effects of this even as consumers in the next 10 plus years, as we have drugs that will cure cancer with just one dose, 100% cure cancer. Like that is happening now. We don't talk about it a lot. And I think that we should.
No, that was actually going to be my follow-up question is what do you think the underlying implications of this increased rate of drug discovery will be on society? What should we expect?
Highly precise medicines. We've been talking about precision medicine for eons, but we can get down to the level of precision where if you will have a cancer in your stomach and I, Sarah, have a cancer in my stomach, they might actually be a different flavor of cancer. It might be a slightly different modality or therapeutic to eradicate that cancer. And before we just didn't know. So we had these blunt tools like chemotherapy. Chemotherapy sucks. My mom went through chemo. It's such a brute force, blunt tool. That is absolutely not acceptable to decrease someone's quality of life in that way in such a blunt hammer approach. Rather, I'm a big believer in these new classes of drugs, for example, immunotherapies, which can use your own body's immune response to kill the cancer. And again, sometimes there's 100% eradication of the cancer. It might be for a specific flavor of cancer. So there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that that universe is expanding and we get to 100% of cancers that can be cured by drugs. But it's super exciting stuff. And I think that we will benefit from it in our lifetime.
I was going to say, what does the timing look like? How far away are we from moving away for certain cancer treatments away from chemotherapy?
It's happening. It's underway. There are some therapies that have already been approved that have 100% effectiveness. Now, because some of them haven't had this data-driven approach, there can also be toxicity. For example, CD19 CAR T therapies showed remarkable effects and response rates for, say, 30% of patients, but then also severe toxicity for half of patients. So that's what I mean by precision medicine. We should have drugs that serve those patients and understand why it's working well for them, and then not give drugs to or give different drugs to the other types of patients that don't have such a terrible risk for things like toxicity. But this is happening now.
And now that we're able to make more data-driven decisions, do you think that the FDA approval process should adapt to the new method of discovery at all, or do you think that's working well?
I do. Because they're going to be bottlenecked and overburdened trying to evaluate all these new drugs. So it has been my experience, FDA is actually great at meeting companies early, giving them pointers so that they're building towards the right things that the FDA will approve. But in the fullness of time, yeah, I do think it makes sense. And, some companies might play a role in that. For example, should there be better requirements for toxicity that maybe a company can provide some sort of platform where the FDA can require all molecules to go through this system to evaluate toxicity before even showing up at their doorstep. Yeah, I could see that world. I would love that. I do think the FDA's reach will need to be expanded, and maybe tools is a way to do that.
What about when it comes to price? I mean, you've seen different options. Was it Mark Cuban's drug company that is really optimizing for lower price prescription medicine? Do you think that will start to be the new norm?
Yeah, people are thinking about price, and I think they need to, because ultimately consumers cannot afford a $500,000 immunotherapy in some cases. Like some of these CAR T drugs are very expensive. Same with cell therapies. And so what I see on the front lines being an investor is entire companies who are devoted to improving production and manufacturing processes, to basically make it so that these drugs are not so costly to manufacture. And then there might be room to lower the price to get them to more patients at the end of the day. Now, will all pharma do this? Will all drugs be like this? No. But I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing. And ultimately, it's competition that's going to bring prices down. Competition in tech.
And on the tech angle too, I know a lot of the price is driven by the cost of R&D, right? So I'd imagine as that comes down and people are trying fewer and fewer things to finally get to something, that I'm assuming that that would likely have cost implications as well.
Totally. That's right. More so, I think, in the case where pharma is developing things in house, maybe a little less so in terms of when pharma is purchasing assets, but definitely reducing the spend in order to get to a drug like candidate has many really positive implications. And I only see that trend continuing because I see ML algorithms getting so good in silico based off of data rooted in biology that all of a sudden you don't need to do 1,000 experiments. Maybe you just need to do one, or maybe you don't need to do any at all. And that means more drugs at the end of the day that can go to the FDA to get approved.
I think something we haven't touched on yet is the intersection of healthcare and employers. How have you noticed employers reevaluating health benefits as we've been in an economic downturn, particularly in terms of focusing on like employee retention without significantly reducing benefits?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you have two sort of flavors of benefits or healthcare with employers. On one hand, you have self insured employers who are very incentivized to manage health because they share in the upside if patients are doing well, their employees are doing well, and then they get penalized if they don't. So, with those types of companies, it's less of a benefit, it's more of cost advantage to provide tools to manage care better. And companies that fall under that bucket can still do well selling through the employer channel as long as they're demonstrating ROI. But I would classify the benefits types companies in a different category, where wellness, for example, which might not actually be tied to health outcomes or perks, things like that, those companies are definitely having a harder time selling through to the employer channel. A strategy that I've seen that works well in healthcare, if you want to ultimately get to the employer, is to potentially think about selling through the benefits broker because they are one to many, work with lots of different customers. If you can get deeply embedded with them, then actually I think the sale becomes a lot easier. It's been a Honestly, it's been a tough slog for companies to sell directly to employers. It's just the nature of this economy that we're in. If you're on the benefit side.
And definitely, I mean, what do you think will be top of mind in terms of benefits this year? I know last year you started seeing a push towards gender affirming care, always a big push into maternity care now and fertilization treatments. So I'm curious what you see, or if you think we'll continue to see those trends, or if there'll be maybe some new benefit perks popping up.
Definitely. I think those trends are continuing, at least from what I'm hearing from HR leaders. In addition, I'm seeing a lot of mental health, the Lyras of the world, for example, that sell through to employers. And then family planning, leave management has also been an area that's come up. And then I would say there are certain pockets that make it easier for you to get the quality care that you need as a patient or as an employee, and those seem to be doing well too. Whether it's help with financing or help with finding a really high quality doctor, which self-insured employers actually care about, because if you go to a high quality doctor, there's less of a chance you'll have an adverse event from something that doctor does wrong. Actually, companies like that have done reasonably well during this time.
Yeah, push towards value-based care.
Totally. Yeah, capitated arrangements, remote kidney care, remote cardiac care, indication specific things too have actually done reasonably well.
Well, we do have two questions to wrap the episode. And the first is, what motivates you to work hard?
It's a deeply personal thing, but I truly believe that my impact on the world can be in helping founders with their world changing ideas. Where I never wanted to be CEO, I never was. I was always COO. I'm very comfortable being behind the scenes, and I'm a people person. So I feel like maybe I can put this capital to use backing founders who, by the way, might be off spec or look a little different from traditional founders, but ultimately I can help them with their ideas that will go on to really impact the world, which also might be a reason why I decided to concentrate in health and bio. It just feels really good when I show up to work every day.
Definitely. And what's a piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
I think probably just to be more compassionate towards myself. I was really hard on myself, and I had a critical inner voice that's been hard to stamp out. In some ways, that got me where I am today and was such an asset. But in other ways, I think for me to last in this industry and do it in a way that's mentally positive and gives me the longevity to still be smiling and optimistic at the end of a 20-year journey, I think, yeah, compassion. Just be nicer and kinder to yourself, young Sarah.
I need to tell myself that. That's helpful.
Great. Well, Sarah, this has been such a fun, interesting conversation. Certainly one that Laura and I will remember. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.